Okay, thanks everyone again for coming along. Today I'm talking about the sort of as Jeff characterised it, the top-down approach. Jeff and Karen talked about a voluntary approach at one end of the product life cycle. I guess we're interested in all ends of the life cycle, and certainly Drum Master is a really good contribution, and I would say should be held up as well as best practice in terms of how to avoid government regulation. But in terms of those areas that do attract regulation, I'm about to talk about reform to those regulations that's underway at this point in time. Reform in this area has got a really long history. I guess I've chosen sort of to start at the more recent end of the history, which is 1999, with the establishment of the Chemicals and Plastics Action Agenda. This then, over time, morphed into the establishment of it's a long word, Reducing the Regulatory Burden on Business Task Force, which produced an important report in 2006. And the reason that was an important report, because that was the genesis of the Productivity Commission review into chemicals and plastics regulation, which in turn produced a report in 2008. What's not on this slide is that then out of that report, COAG picked up, in fact, most, if not all, of the recommendations of the PC report and put that into part of their very extensive reform agenda. And from that, in 2010, the Primary Industries Ministerial Council endorsed a national policy framework into the development of a single national framework for ag-vet chemicals, and this was subsequently agreed to by COAG in, I think, August last year. So I guess starting from the beginning, what are the reform issues that we face? And look, there are multiple issues. I've categorised them into 4 areas. The first area is basically overly complex and prescriptive regulation. This is really characterised by often unclear systems and processes, not good for business, not good for community either, for that matter. We have a lot of duplication and inconsistent regulation. For instance, there are differences in the licensing and training requirements imposed on pesticide applicators. In the case of APVMA regulatory conditions, you have various interpretations of those regulatory conditions, which range from a prescriptive interpretation to a performance-based approach. We have gaps in the regulatory framework. A real gap that we've got now is that we don't have a holistic risk framework that covers the entire regulatory system, noting the regulatory system spans both the Commonwealth and the states. We have access issues for minor use crops, and we have issues with monitoring and feedback loops, and by issues I mean in some cases there are clear inadequacies there. And I guess that brings it down to the 4th category, which is really about what happens when you've got deficiencies in one part of the system. Well, I can answer that question because you get overcompensation in other parts of the system, which lead to business costs and other unintended outcomes. That sort of moves neatly into why are these problems? Well, I think there are problems there for 3 major groups. First being business, and by that we mean chemical manufacturers, because you get higher costs as a result of regulatory inefficiencies. That in turn leads to changed production systems over time. An example there would be you just basically have less minor crops because you don't have the chemical access for those crops. You have reduced innovation. Through that you get pest resistance, less new chemistry coming through, and you have higher barriers to competitive entry. Now I've listed generics there, but it's really across the board. I mean, if you've got higher costs of production, high costs to barriers to entry, you really just get less products full stop. But then down the track that means you end up with less generics. For consumers, look, it's really the flip side of the same coin in a lot of ways. Because you've got reduced access for things like minor crops, consumers have less access to minor crops, or minor crop products, I should say. And then you inevitably lead into higher farm costs, which feed into food costs. Because basically at this point in time, ag and vet chemicals constitute around 17% of farm input costs. So they're not insignificant at all. And then finally, we would say that if you don't get your regulatory system right, there's a potential for reduced community confidence in that regulatory system. This in turn feeds back into the political process, which you could argue leads to an overcompensation in the regulatory system. And there's always dangers of that happening. In terms of the reform processes that we're engaged in right now, basically three main areas. One is the development of a single national regulatory framework for ag and vet chemicals under the COAG banner. Complementing this, the Commonwealth is implementing a better regulation partnership commitment to reform the APVMA, the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority. And there's some follow-up work to the COAG early harvest reforms that's basically ongoing. Reforms delivered to date. I guess we'd say that the passage of the Ag Vet Chemicals Code Amendment Bill 2010, passed last year on the 24th of June, was a major milestone. This is the first significant change to legislation for some time in this area. It addressed a number of what we would say relatively easily addressed issues that business have had with the Ag Vet Code, such as, for instance, if I move down to the fourth point, something as simple as that. Before, the code required that the approved person be, believe it or not, a physical person that had to be notified, the name of that person had to be notified to the APVMA, who would have to duly note that in their files. And if that person changed in name, or just simply moved, and there was another approved person, physical approved person, that then meant that company was required to notify the APVMA, and they in turn then had to note that on their files. Now that's all been changed. It's about nominating the approved person as a legal entity, which is the company name essentially with an address attached to it. So it doesn't matter what changes within the company. We really need to know what the company's doing. So, and there are label changes in this bill, which has made it easier for business for manufacturers, and that'll flow through to end users and consumers. It'll make it to make changes to the label that have nothing to do at all with the registration of the product. So in other words, if there's some sort of brand name or something like that on the label, the manufacturers now can make a change to that label without having to go back to the APVMA. Previously, it was a requirement that any change to that label had to be approved by the APVMA. So there are various changes that have come through that amendment code bill. And another one, I guess, just finishing off the list a little bit, is that in relation to allowing the APVMA, in the case of an applicant for an emergency use or a minor use permit, to make that applicant aware that there may be, or in the case where there is another minor use permit or an emergency use permit currently out there, to make that applicant aware that there is another person or another group of people who have that minor use permit, and enable those two groups to talk to each other. Previously, that wasn't allowed. In effect, that person or that applicant had to find out for themselves whether or not there was another minor use permit out there, and therefore hope to exchange data and make life easier for themselves.